Hello, friends. Woo! It's the weekend. I can hear children playing outside my door. Maybe scooters will go past. We continue with part 3 of this. This will be a shorter part, pages 48 to 56, because after that it gets into a huge list of the laws that the Lord Mayor passed to deal with the plague. So I'll do that all in one bunch tomorrow. In the meantime, Defoe's narrator goes on much as he did before, moaning about the stupid poor, although I think stupid means senseless rather than complete thickos. He mentions the court as well. If you don't know, the court, the royal court, not the theatre, this is the court of Charles II with the big wig and the spaniel and the high-heeled shoes, who was king after a brief flirtation with not having a king. Oliver Cromwell, Lord Protector, a Puritan. He defeated Charles II's father, Charles I, in the Civil War. Charles I was publicly executed, and then Oliver Cromwell closed all the pubs and all the theatres. And according to my friend Gemma Brockis, who did a lot of research for a great show, which I might post a link to below, Cromwell tried to replace holidays with days of national humiliation. And then he died, and Charles II was put on the throne, which is why they talk about the gay, luxurious court, who have all fled off into Oxford. And all the entertainments that were suddenly allowed in London, including some I had to look up. Merry Andrews just means clown. And there's a Jack something or other. Let me look at the Merry Andrews and the rope dancers. I think that's pretty much what it sounds like. Jack puddings. Jack pudding, I think, just means a clown. Apart from that, it's pretty grim what follows. Although we do have the word abracadabra in a pyramid. But yes, one thing that suddenly occurred to me looking back over the video, he talks about tokens. These tokens mean the marks of the plague, basically buboes. They are not to be confused with bills, which are ads. Okay, the truth is, the case of poor servants was very dismal, as I shall have occasion to mention again by and by. For it was apparent a prodigious number of them would be turned away, and it was so. And of them abundance perished, and particularly of those that these false prophets had flattered with hopes that they should be continued in their services, and carried with their masters and mistresses into the country. And had not public charity provided for these poor creatures, whose number was exceeding great, and in all cases of this nature must be so, they would have been in the worst condition of any people in the city. These things agitated the minds of the common people for many months, while the first apprehensions were upon them, and while the plague was not, as I may say, yet broken out. But I must also not forget that the more serious part of the inhabitants behaved after another manner. The government encouraged their devotion, and appointed public prayers and days of fasting and humiliation, to make public confession of sin and implore the mercy of God to avert the dreadful judgment which hung over their heads. And it's not to be expressed with what alacrity the people of all persuasions embraced the occasion, how they flocked to the churches and meetings, and they were also thronged that there was often no coming near, no, not to the very doors of the largest churches. Also there were daily prayers appointed morning and evening at several churches, and days of private praying at other places, and all which the people attended, I say, with an uncommon devotion. Several private families also, as well as one opinion as of another, kept family fasts to which they admitted their near relations only. So that, in a word, those people who were really serious and religious applied themselves in a truly Christian manner to the proper work of repentance and humiliation, as Christian people ought to do. Again, the public showed that they would bear their share in these things. The very court, which was then gay and luxurious, put on a face of just concern for the public danger. All the plays and interludes, which after the manner of the French court had been set up and began to increase among us, were forbid to act. The gaming tables, public dancing rooms, and music houses, which multiplied and began to debauch the manners of the people, were shut up and suppressed. And the Jack puddings, Merry Andrews, puppet shows, rope dancers, and such like doings, which had bewitched the poor common people, shut up their shops, finding indeed no trade. For the minds of the people were agitated with other things, and a kind of sadness and horror at these things sat upon the countenances even of the common people. Death was before their eyes, and everybody began to think of their graves, not of mirth and diversions. But even those wholesome reflections, which rightly managed would have most happily led the people to fall upon their knees make confession of their sins, and look up to their merciful Saviour for pardon, imploring his compassion on them in such a time of their distress, by which we might have been as a second Nineveh, had a quite contrary extreme in the common people, who, ignorant and stupid in their reflections, as they were brutishly wicked and thoughtless before, were now led by their frights to extremes of folly. And as I have said before, that they ran to conjurers and witches and all sorts of deceivers to know what should become of them, who fed their fears and kept them always alarmed and awake on purpose to delude them and pick their pockets, so they were as mad upon their running after quacks and mountebanks, and every practising old woman for medicines and remedies, storing themselves with such multitudes of pills, potions, and preservatives, as they were called, that they not only spent their money, but even poisoned themselves beforehand for fear of the poison of the infection, and prepared their bodies for the plague instead of preserving them against it. On the other hand, it is incredible and scarce to be imagined how the posts of houses and corners of streets were plastered with doctors' bills and papers of ignorant fellows, quacking and tampering in physic, and inviting the people to come to them for remedies, which was generally set off with such flourishes as these, viz., infallible preventative pills against the plague, never-failing preservatives against the infection, sovereign cordials against the corruption of the air, exact regulations for the conduct of the body in case of an infection, anti-pestilential pills, incomparable drink against the plague, never found out before, an universal remedy for the plague, the only true plague water, the royal antidote against all kinds of infection, and such a number more that I cannot reckon up, and if I could would fill a book of themselves to set them down. Others set up bills to summon people to their lodgings for directions and advice in the case of infection. These had specious titles, such as these: an eminent High Dutch physician, newly come over from Holland, where he resided during all the time of the Great Plague last year in Amsterdam, and cured multitudes of people that actually had the plague upon them. An Italian gentlewoman, just arrived from Naples, having a choice secret to prevent infection, which she found out by her great experience, and did wonderful cures with it in the late plague there, wherein there died 20,000 in one day. An ancient gentlewoman, having practised with great success in the late plague in this city, anno 1636, gives her advice only to the female sex, to be spoken with, etc. An experienced physician, who has long studied the doctrine of antidotes against all sorts of poisons and infections, has, after 40 years' practice, arrived at such skill as may, with God's blessing, direct persons how to prevent their being touched by any contagious distemper whatsoever. He directs the poor gratis. I take notice of these by way of specimen. I could give you 2 or 3 dozens of the like, and yet have abundance left behind. 'Tis sufficient from these to apprise anyone of the humour of those times, and how a set of thieves and pickpockets not only robbed and cheated the poor people of their money, but poisoned their bodies with odious and fatal preparations, some with mercury, and some with other things as bad, perfectly remote from the thing pretended to, and rather hurtful than serviceable to the body in case an infection followed. I cannot omit a subtlety of one of those quack operators, with which he gulled the poor people to crowd about him, but did nothing for them without money. He had, it seems, added to his bills, which he gave about the streets, this advertisement in capital letters, viz., he gives advice to the poor for nothing. Abundance of poor people came to him accordingly, to whom he made a great many fine speeches, examined them of the state of their health and of the constitution of their bodies, and told them many good things for them to do, which were of no great moment. But the issue and conclusion of all was, that he had a preparation which, if they took such a quantity of every morning, he would pawn his life they should never have the plague, no, though they lived in the house with people that were infected. This made the people all resolve to have it. But then the price of that was so much, I think 'twas 1/2 a crown. But, sir, says one poor woman, I am a poor almswoman, and am kept by the parish, and your bills say you give the poor your help for nothing. Ay, good woman, says the doctor, so I do, as I publish there. I give my advice to the poor for nothing, but not my physic. Alas, sir, says she, that is a snare laid for the poor then, for you give them advice for nothing, that is to say, you advise them, gratis, to buy your physic for their money, well, so does every shopkeeper with his wares. Here the woman began to give him ill words, and stood at his door all that day, telling her tale to all the people that came, till the doctor, finding she turned away his customers, was obliged to call her upstairs again, and give her his box of physic for nothing. Which perhaps, too, was good for nothing when she had it. But to return to the people, whose confusions fitted them to be imposed upon by all sorts of pretenders and by every mountebank. There is no doubt but these quacking sort of fellows raised great gains out of the miserable people, for we daily found the crowds that ran after them were infinitely greater, and their doors were more thronged than those of Dr. Brooks, Dr. Upton, Dr. Hodges, Dr. Berwick, or any of the most famous men of the time, and I was told that some of them got £5 a day by their physic. But there was still another madness beyond all this, which may serve to give an idea of the distracted humour of the poor people at that time. And this was their following a worse sort of deceivers than any of these. For these petty thieves only deluded them to pick their pockets and get their money, in which their wickedness, whatever it was, lay chiefly on the side of the deceivers, not upon the deceived. But in this part, I'm going to mention, it lay chiefly in the people deceived, or equally in both. And this was in wearing charms, philters, exorcisms, amulets, and I know not what preparations to fortify the body with them against the plague, as if the plague was not the hand of God, but a kind of possession of an evil spirit, and that it was to be kept off with crossings, signs of the zodiac, papers tied up with so many knots, and certain words or figures written on them, as particular the word abracadabra, formed in a triangle or pyramid, thus: abracadabra, abracadabra, abracadab, abracadab, abracad, abraca, abrac, abra, ab. Others had the Jesuit's mark in a cross, IHS. Others nothing but this mark, thus. I might spend a great deal of time in my exclamations against the follies and indeed the wickedness of those things in a time of such degree, in a matter of such consequences as this of a national infection. But my memorandums of these things relate rather to take notice only of the fact, and mention only that it was so. How the poor people found the insufficiency of those things, and how many of them were afterwards carried away in the dead carts, and thrown into the common graves of every parish with these hellish charms and trumpery hanging about their necks, remains to be spoken of as we go along. All this was the effect of the hurry the people were in, after the first notion of the plague being at hand was among them, and which may be said to be from about Michaelmas 1664, but more particularly after the 2 men died in St. Giles's in the beginning of December, and again after another alarm in February. For when the plague evidently spread itself, they soon began to see the folly of trusting to those unperforming creatures who had gulled them of their money, and then their fears worked another way, namely to amazement and stupidity, not knowing what course to take or what to do either to help or relieve themselves. But they ran about from one neighbour's house to another, and even in the streets from one door to another, with repeated cries of, "Lord, have mercy on us! What shall we do?" Indeed, the poor people were to be pitied in one particular thing in which they had little or no relief, and which I desire to mention with a serious awe and reflection which perhaps everyone that reads this may not relish. Namely that, whereas death now began not, as you may say, to hover over everyone's head only, but to look into their houses and chambers and stare in their faces. Though there might be some stupidity and dullness of the mind, and there was so a great deal, yet there was a great deal of just alarm sounded into the very inmost soul, if I may say so, of others. Many consciences were awakened, many hard hearts melted into tears, many a penitent confession was made of crimes long concealed. It would wound the soul of any Christian to have heard the dying groans of many a despairing creature, and none durst come near to comfort them. Many a robbery, many a murder was then confessed aloud, and nobody surviving to record the accounts of it. People might be heard even into the streets as we passed along, calling upon God for mercy through Jesus Christ, and saying, "I have been a thief, I have been an adulterer, I have been a murderer," and the like, and none durst stop to make the least inquiry into such things, or to administer comfort to the poor creatures that in the anguish both of soul and body thus cried out. Some of the ministers did visit the sick at first for a little while, but it was not to be done. It would have been present death to have gone into some houses. The very buriers of the dead, who were the hardenedest creatures in town, were sometimes beaten back and so terrified that they durst not go into houses where the whole families were swept away together, and where the circumstances were more particularly horrible, as some were. But this was indeed at the very first heat of the distemper. Time inured them to it all. and they ventured everywhere afterwards without hesitation, as I shall have occasion to mention at large hereafter. I am supposing now the plague to be begun, as I have said, and that the magistrates began to take the condition of the people into their serious consideration. What they did as to the regulation of the inhabitants and of infected families I shall speak to by itself. But as to the affair of health, it is proper to mention it here that having seen the foolish humour of the people in running after quacks and mountebanks, wizards and fortune-tellers, which they did, as above, even to madness, the Lord Mayor, a very sober and religious gentleman, appointed physicians and surgeons for relief of the poor, I mean the diseased poor, and in particular ordered the College of Physicians to publish directions for cheap remedies for the poor, in all the circumstances of the distemper. This, indeed, was one of the most charitable and judicious things that could be done at that time, for this drove the people from haunting the doors of every disperser of bills, and from taking down blindly and without consideration poison for physic and death instead of life. This direction of the physicians was done by a consultation of the whole college, and as it was particularly calculated of the use of the poor and for cheap medicines, it was made public, so that everybody might see it, and copies were given gratis to all that desired it. But as it is public, and to be seen on all occasions, I need not give the reader of this the trouble of it. I shall not be supposed to lessen the authority or capacity of the physicians when I say that the violence of the distemper, when it came to its extremity, was like the fire next year. The fire, which consumed what the plague could not touch, defied all the application of remedies. The fire engines were broken, the buckets thrown away, and the power of man was baffled and brought to an end. So the plague defied all medicines. The very physicians were seized with it, with their preservatives in their mouths, and men went about prescribing to others and telling them what to do till the tokens were upon them, and they dropped down dead, destroyed by that very enemy they directed others to oppose. This was the case of several physicians, even some of them the most eminent, and of several of the most skilful surgeons. Abundance of quacks, too, died, who had the folly to trust to their own medicines, which they must needs be conscious to themselves were good for nothing, and who rather ought, like other sorts of thieves, to have run away sensible of their guilt from the justice that they could not but expect should punish them, as they knew they had deserved. Not that it is any derogation from the labour or application of the physicians to say they fell in the common calamity, nor is it so intended by me. It rather is to their praise that they ventured their lives so far as even to lose them in the service of mankind. They endeavoured to do good, and to save the lives of others. But we were not to expect that the physicians could stop God's judgments, or prevent a distemper eminently armed from heaven from executing the errand it was sent about. Doubtless the physicians assisted many by their skill, and by their prudence and applications to the saving of their lives and restoring their health. But it is not lessening their character or their skill to say they could not cure those that had the tokens upon them, or those who were mortally infected before the physicians were sent for, as was frequently the case. It remains to mention now what public measures were taken by the magistrates for the general safety and to prevent the spreading of the distemper when it first broke out. I shall have frequent occasion to speak of the prudence of the magistrates, their charity, their vigilance for the poor, and for preserving good order, furnishing provisions of the like when the plague was increased, as it afterwards was. But I am now upon the order and regulations they published for the government of infected families. Yes, and that's where I'll stop before we launch into exactly what laws were passed, which I might put a suit on for, or something, get dressed for that. Kind of remain indoors style. I might post a link to the next video. That will go up when it's up tomorrow. Alright, I hope you're all doing superbly, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye bye.